The stories on this channel are completely fictionalized, and the human videos are AI generated. Read disclaimer carefully. Someone's been in your house. Get out. I walk fast, slower in the mind. The hallway nightlight glowed like a promise that should have kept me safe. Tom's voice shook. I had heard it like that before. Before we dive in, subscribe to the channel and comment where you're listening from. I recognized the knock before I looked at the clock. 3 firm raps. A pause. One more, heavier. That rhythm belonged to Tom Harris, my neighbor. He was the kind of man who returned tools sharper than when he borrowed them. He never knocked like that unless something was wrong. I pushed myself up, blinking against the blur. 3 a.m. glowed in red digits on the bedside clock. The house made its usual night sounds. The soft hum of the fridge, the faint tick of the hallway clock. Nothing out of place. No footsteps. No voices. For a moment I wondered if Tom had dreamed his way to my porch. "Daniel, open up." His voice was low but urgent, like he was keeping something in check. I pulled on a sweater and went barefoot to the door. The carpet felt colder than usual. The framed photo of my father hung beside the door, glass smudged with a fingerprint. I told myself it was mine. When I opened the door, Tom stood there, the porch light behind him casting his face in half shadow. His jaw worked like he was chewing on words he didn't want to say. "Someone was in your house," he said. "Get out." I stared at him. "What did you see?" "Not what." "Who?" "Tall. Moved like he belonged there." "I called your name. He didn't turn." I wanted to believe it was a mistake. "Maybe you saw the coat rack. It catches the light from the street." He shook his head. "Daniel, I built that rack. I know what I saw." "I checked the yard," Tom went on. "No prints in the dew. He didn't leave out the back, if he left at all." The words landed heavier than I expected. I glanced over my shoulder. The hallway was dim. The door to the storage room was almost shut. I didn't remember closing it. Tom lifted his phone, showing me a recent call from an unknown number. "He called me, said your name, told me to look out my window. I saw him in your kitchen." Then he hung up. I shook my head. "Why call you?" "No idea." "Let's call the police from my place," he said. My mind flashed to the boxes from my father's garage and the storage room, to a file folder I hadn't opened in years, and to one thing I'd promised not to touch, but had touched anyway. "Give me 1 minute," I said before I could stop myself. "Daniel." His voice softened. "Please." I stepped back inside. He didn't follow. Whether that was respect or caution, I couldn't tell. The hallway smelled faintly of cedar, something that didn't belong in my house. My closet smelled of detergent and paint, not wood. I stopped breathing to listen. The fridge hummed. The clock ticked. From the kitchen came a slow, steady drip. The living room looked untouched. The blanket I'd used earlier lay crumpled on the floor where I'd left it. The window latch was still secure. My father used to check the doors this way at night, after arguments he couldn't let go of. He trusted wood to swell and hold better than any lock. At the storage room, I pushed the door open. The boxes were as I'd stacked them. On top of one sat a black duffel, unzipped slightly, then zipped back again. I didn't touch it. In the kitchen, the drip grew louder. The vase by the window had been turned so its long crack faced away. On the counter lay a pen, black body, gold tip worn to silver. My father's pen. He'd lost it the week I turned 18 and accused me of taking it. I'd spent days searching drawers to prove I hadn't. He never apologized. My phone buzzed. Tom again. "You need to come out now," he said. "I'm calling the police." "I found something. Don't look for reasons to stay." "I'll be out in a minute," I said, hanging up before he could reply. I picked up the pen with a paper towel. The weight felt the same. On my grocery list beneath fresh fruit and batteries, someone had tested its ink, a straight line that trembled slightly at the end. The back door was locked. The key still hung in its place. On the mat lay a small dark spot. I touched it. Water. In the hallway, the nightlight flickered once and steadied. The storage room knob felt warm. I opened the door wide, set the duffel on the floor, unzipped it an inch. Cedar flooded the air. My father had lined his old tool chest with cedar. He'd kept papers there. Ones he'd promised to burn and never did. My phone buzzed again. Voicemail from an unknown number. One message. I didn't listen. From the kitchen came a faint scrape. I turned toward it slowly. The drawer to my left had moved half an inch, the one that sticks unless you lift it just right. It moved again, then stopped. But what I heard next changed everything. The floor creaked in the wrong place. I knew the way this house spoke at night. This sound came from a board that had no right to move. The sticky drawer to my left had shifted earlier. Now the noise rose from the hallway behind me. Slow and patient. I stood still. My breathing kept shallow. My eyes traced the faint edges of the kitchen. Cedar and dust still hung in the air. Out on the porch, Tom's voice carried in low bursts. He was giving my address. He told someone to come quickly. Another sound followed, deeper in the hall. Not a step, but the shift of weight finding its own familiar mark. The house can know you. It had known me, and before me it had known my father. He called it a good house. He also called it temporary, like everything else we held. I stepped onto a patch of tile that never squeaked. I had learned these safe spots years ago, walking the floors at night when sleep refused me. My father sometimes found me here. He would sit at the table without turning on the light and talk in that low voice that only made sense in the dark. Men in my family learned to speak best when no one could see their faces. I kept to the facts I could trust. The back door was locked. The key still hung from its hook. The window latch was closed. The storage room door was open now, though I had left it shut before. The black duffel sat with its zipper drawn nearly closed, cedar air trapped inside. The dripping sink had gone silent on its own. That meant someone had turned the tap. The pen from the counter was gone. Whoever took it had wanted me to notice its absence. The hallway nightlight threw a soft wash across the floor. My shadow crossed it and seemed to shift on its own. I mapped the layout in my head. Hallway, storage room on the left, bathroom door partly open, bedroom at the far end. The treacherous board that complained under the weight of a step was inside the second bedroom, not in the hall. I whispered my own name, just as Tom had called it outside. Silence answered. Memory stirred. Age 10. Kitchen table in another house. My father writing, the pen scratching like a careful insect. He would tap the cap on his teeth. He would say, almost done. He would say not to open the drawer, always the one that sticks. I stepped farther into the hall. The air felt cooler, as though a window stood ajar. I knew they were all closed. I had checked them before bed. The photographs on the wall showed a life I had tried to claim, a hike with my brother before our silence began, a small victory at work, a housewarming where Tom brought pie and warned me about the fence line. One picture held my father in a rare half-smile. He preferred rules to cameras. Rules for drawers, rules for papers, rules about which truths stayed in which rooms. I had thought this house might keep those rules for me. I was wrong. The creak came again, closer. I stepped backward into the kitchen, the island now between me and the hallway. I left the knives where they were. Fear in this house did not need props. In the window above the sink, my reflection hovered over the darkness outside. The vase beside it showed its long crack again. Someone had turned it back from the way I had found it earlier. The counter was bare where the pen had been, though the faint testing line still marked my grocery list. Cedar had no place here. It belonged to my father's old tool chest, where he kept papers he promised to destroy. When he grew sick, I took boxes from his garage without his permission. I told myself it was to keep them safe. The truth was, I wanted answers. Neither reason was clean. A faint sound brushed the air from the living room. the texture of fabric shifting under a hand. I watched the doorway. Nothing moved. "If you can hear me, you should leave now," I said. The room gave nothing back. I thought of calling my brother. The last time we spoke, he said he was done being the messenger. I had asked what message. He hung up. We had both been trained in silence by the same man. I touched the small dark mark on the mat by the back door. It had dried around the edge, tacky at the center, like something had been placed there briefly, then taken away. The hook still held the key. So why leave a trace without taking the thing itself? I bent near the drawer that sticks and listened. Inside, only air. The scrape from before made sense only if someone had opened it and let it fall back a fraction, the way I sometimes did when tired. The hallway sighed. I turned my head. The storage room door swayed, though no window was open. The boxes inside looked untouched. The duffel waited. I pulled the zipper halfway. The cedar scent rose faintly. Under a sweater lay a bundle of envelopes tied in cotton twine, each marked with a date. Some were older than me. I stepped back into the kitchen. A soft click reached my ear, like metal touching glass. I looked at the window. The night outside was still, except for the weak cone of Tom's porch light. Tom himself was gone from view. My hand slid along the island's edge. My father used to lay out his tools in careful rows, each with its own space. He believed that order kept secrets still. He was wrong. The wrong creak came again, this time from near the pantry. I turned. The door was closed, silence pressed down. The clock in the hall ticked once. When I turned back, something sat on the counter that had not been there before. Small, white, out of place. On the counter lay a single white pawn. But what I found next changed everything. I had not seen that pen in 15 years. It now rested beside the pawn, its black barrel gleaming under the dim kitchen light, gold tip worn to silver at the edge. It should have been impossible for it to appear here again. I had watched my father lose it in another lifetime. I had listened to him accuse me of taking it, the charge carrying more weight than the object itself. 15 years ago, that pen was a weapon, not in the physical sense, but in the way he wielded it. He used it to sign checks, notes, and ultimatums. He would drum it against the table until the sound became unbearable. When he pointed it at you, he might as well have pointed a blade. I touched it now with the edge of my sleeve. The balance was the same, just a fraction heavier at the front from years of use. The cap was still loose enough to turn without sound, a trick he used when thinking. A familiar scratch along the clip matched a memory of the day it had fallen onto the driveway scraping against concrete. That day I had picked it up and returned it. He had looked at me like I had stolen something more than metal and ink. The pawn and the pen sat side by side like two quiet accusations, one from the past, one from whoever was here now. I tried to make sense of the pairing. My father didn't play chess often, but when he did, he played the white pieces, always insisting on starting from that side. The pawn was his least favorite piece. He would mutter about its weakness, its limited range, yet he kept one on his desk, alone, as if to remind himself what could be sacrificed. The cedar scent in the air deepened as I stared at them. I saw his old workshop, dust motes floating through the angled light. I saw the tool chest lined in cedar, its drawers hiding documents I was told never to read. I saw the day I broke that rule. I was 20, tired of being told to wait for explanations that never came. Inside I had found letters that hinted at deals made without signatures, at money that passed hands in cash, two of which I had heard only in whispers. My father had found me in there. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. He stood in the doorway and asked one question. "What do you think you know?" I had no answer. That silence cost me more than I realized at the time. We spoke less after that. Even when he was sick, we didn't bridge the distance. Now here was his pen again, placed in my kitchen by a hand that wanted me to remember. Whoever left it knew its history. They knew what it meant to me, or they knew what it had meant to him. I picked up the pawn first. Its surface was smooth, cheap plastic, the kind you'd find in a set missing half its pieces. A faint smudge on the base caught my eye. Ink. Black ink. I turned it over in my palm. The smudge formed a straight line with a small tremor at the end, like the test mark on my grocery list. Someone was sending a message. I couldn't decide if it was meant to warn me or lure me deeper. The fridge hummed behind me, louder now. Or maybe the quiet in the rest of the house just made it seem that way. I thought of Tom outside, still on his porch, maybe watching, maybe gone. I hadn't heard him in several minutes. I looked down the hallway toward the storage room. The door was ajar again, wider than before. That meant either I hadn't closed it all the way, or someone wanted me to think I hadn't. The air in the kitchen shifted slightly, as if a door somewhere had been opened or closed. I tightened my grip on the pawn and set it back beside the pen. The pen belonged in a locked drawer in a house that no longer stood. The pawn belonged on a board in a game my father claimed he didn't value. Both were here, in my space, without invitation. I thought of my brother again. He'd been there the day the pen disappeared. He'd laughed when my father accused me, and I'd hated him for it. Later he admitted he hadn't believed the accusation, but he hadn't defended me either. Better you than me, he'd said. It had been the last thing he told me before leaving for good. A sound from the front of the house pulled me out of the memory. A faint metallic shift. I turned my head toward the living room. The sound came again, clearer this time. The front door rattled softly, as if tested. But what I heard after that made me forget the pawn, the pen, and everything else. The door did not open, but someone whispered my name. The voice slid through the thin space between wood and frame, low enough to make me doubt I had heard it. My pulse found its way into my ears. The whisper carried familiarity, not in the words themselves, but in the way the syllables leaned on each other. I did not move. If I stayed still, maybe the voice would decide I wasn't here. Or maybe that was exactly what it wanted, to be met with silence. Daniel? Again the same low tone, a pause long enough to make me think it was gone, followed by a faint exhale like someone was leaning in close to the door. The front door's deadbolt was still in place. I had locked it before bed, but locks are only as strong as the wood they're set in, and I had seen this frame splinter under less. I stayed in the kitchen, island between me and the hallway. My hands rested flat on the counter. The pawn and the pen sat where I had left them. Their stillness mocked mine. Returning to the voice belonged to someone I hadn't heard in years but had carried with me anyway. It was my brother's voice, or close enough to make the memory ache. He had a way of speaking my name like he was asking me to agree to something before I even knew what it was. The last time I heard him say it like that was the night before he left. We had argued in the driveway. He wanted something from me. Money, trust, both. I had said no, and he'd smiled, without humor. "You'll change your mind," he'd told me. "You always do." He left before sunrise. Now the voice was here at my door. I thought of calling Tom, but his absence from the porch was its own answer. If he was still nearby, he wasn't making himself known. The whisper came again, softer. "Let me in." It stepped toward the hallway, feet finding the quiet patches of floor. The nightlight's glow met me halfway. I could see the door from here, the outline of the handle, the shadow of the frame. If it was my brother, why whisper? Why not knock? Call out, demand. That wasn't his way. Unless he wasn't alone. I reached the small table by the wall and picked up the flashlight I kept there. I didn't turn it on. The click might travel through the door. The voice came again, no louder than before. "You don't have to see me. Just listen." I had spent years not listening. That choice had its own cost, but it was mine. A thought pressed in. If I answered, I would be giving away my position in the house. If I stayed silent, I might never know if the voice was real. The moral choice was tangled. My brother had lied before. He had also told truths I didn't want to hear. If I opened the door, I might be letting in the past, dressed in a new danger. If I didn't, I might be turning away the only person who could explain the pawn, the pen, and the cedar scent. My fingers hovered over the deadbolt. The metal felt colder than the air. I remembered another night. Different door, different house. My father had refused to let my brother in after he'd been gone for months. My brother had stood outside in the rain, asking for just a few minutes. My father had told me not to move. I had stood by the window, watching the drops gather in his hair, his hands buried in his jacket pockets. He didn't look up at me. I didn't wave. The weight of that moment sat heavy in my palm now, pressing against the decision I hadn't made. I turned halfway toward the kitchen, unsure which direction meant safety anymore. The island, the counter, the small symbols left for me, they all felt like part of a map I hadn't learned to read. The whisper came again, but this time it said nothing more than my name, drawn out, gentle. Then silence. I waited for a follow-up sound, footsteps, retreating, the creak of the porch, but the air held steady. I backed into the kitchen, keeping my eyes on the hallway. My phone lay on the counter beside the pawn and pen. The screen was dark. I picked it up, intending to call Tom, but before I could, the phone buzzed in my hand. One new voicemail. Unknown number. Heard it ring. I played the message twice before realizing what it meant. The first time through, I thought I was imagining parts of it. A sound I thought was breathing. My name said in a voice I couldn't pin down. A pause, long enough to make me think the caller had hung up, and then a single sentence. You still keep it in the vent. That was all. No threat, no demand, just the calm certainty of someone who knew more than they should. I replayed it immediately, this time holding the phone tighter, like I could squeeze something more out of the recording. Same cadence, same pause, same sentence. And underneath it, faint but there, a tap, tap, tap. Not like typing, more like a ring knocking against a table. When it ended, I stood in the kitchen without moving, phone still pressed to my ear. I tried to think of the last time I'd told anyone about the vent. I hadn't even told Tom. My father had shown it to me when I first moved in. He'd called it a good hiding place, the way someone might compliment a pocket knife. He'd told me that houses keep their secrets in the walls, if you let them. I had taken that literally. Over the years, the vent had held things I didn't want to leave in drawers. Cash, spare keys, papers I wasn't sure I should have. Right now, I couldn't remember exactly what was in there. That uncertainty made the back of my neck prickle. The room felt different after the voicemail. The air seemed heavier, the shadows more certain of themselves. I thought about the pawn, the pen, the cedar scent, each one an intrusion that now seemed part of a single pattern. Someone had been close enough to my life to know about that vent, close enough to watch without being seen. The idea of safety had always been simple for me. Doors locked, windows latched, routines kept. My father believed safety was knowing what could hurt you and getting to it first. I had chosen the quieter version. Until tonight, I thought it had worked. I set the phone down and looked toward the hallway. The vent was in the far wall, near the floor, just past the storage room. If the caller knew about it, maybe they had already been there tonight. Maybe they'd taken something. Maybe they'd left something. The choice was to leave it alone until police came or open it myself now. If I waited, I might never know what had been there. If I looked, I'd have to deal with whatever I found. I walked to the hallway slowly, each step giving the night more room to make its noises. The storage room door stood open again, a little wider than before. I didn't stop. Kneeling in front of the vent, I ran my fingers along the edges. The metal cover was cold, its screws loose from the last time I'd been in there. I hadn't thought about tightening them. That felt careless now. I unscrewed the cover with my fingertips, setting it gently on the floor. The cedar scent hit me immediately, stronger than before. I reached inside. My hand brushed something thin and flat. Paper. Not loose, but folded. I pulled it out. It was an envelope. Cream-colored, worn soft at the edges, no name on the front. I turned it over. The flap wasn't sealed. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. I didn't open it yet. I just sat there on the floor, envelope in my hand, staring down the hallway toward the kitchen where the pawn and pen waited. Whatever this was, it wasn't random. Someone had been here tonight to leave reminders of a history I'd tried to keep still. The voicemail was just the voice on the other side of that history, letting me know the walls had been listening the whole time. The paper inside the envelope was heavier than normal, the kind my father used for letters that mattered, the kind he'd sometimes burn after reading. I wondered if this one had been meant for fire too, but had found its way here instead. I didn't open it, not yet, because from somewhere close, too close, I heard the faint creak of a step. The paper inside smelled faintly of cedar and dust. I unfolded it slowly, careful not to tear the edges. The handwriting was my father's. Tight, deliberate strokes that looked like they'd been carved into the page instead of written. He had always written that way, even on notes meant for the trash. The first line was direct. If you're reading this, it means I couldn't burn it in time. I kept going. Each sentence pulled me further from the hallway and deeper into a memory I had avoided for years. He described an agreement made before I was born, one that tied him to a man named Carter Haynes. The name sat heavy on the page. Carter had been at our house when I was a kid, always in pressed shirts, always smiling in a way that made my mother's shoulders tighten. My father trusted him, or maybe he feared him. I never could tell. The letter made it clear. A debt had been exchanged, not in money, but in silence. My father had kept something hidden for Carter, something that could ruin more than one name. In return, Carter had promised that our family would never be touched. Then, in the final paragraph, my father admitted he'd broken the agreement, not by speaking, but by keeping proof in case he ever needed it. He didn't say what the proof was, only that it was sealed away where even I can't look at it without knowing it's there. The paper trembled in my hands. I told myself it was because of the cold creeping in through the vent, but the truth was less comfortable. The cedar scent had traveled with the envelope, the same scent that had been drifting through the house all night. Whoever had been here knew exactly where to find it. I sat back against the wall. If the letter was in the vent, maybe the proof my father mentioned was still in the house, somewhere else. Or maybe that's what they'd already come for tonight. The voice in the voicemail, calm, certain, had said, "You still keep it in the vent." Not kept. Keep. Present tense, like they were sure it was still here. Maybe they didn't know I'd just taken it out. Maybe they did. If you're hooked so far, hit like and subscribe for more stories like this. I read the letter again, this time slower. My father's careful phrasing made more sense now that I could see the edges of fear in it. He hadn't just been protecting himself. He'd been protecting someone else in our family. The way he wrote about my brother stood out, not by name, but in sideways references, the one who carries more than his share of the blame, the one I would spare from the truth if I could. It was the kind of half-confession that made me wonder if my brother had known about this all along, the kind that made me question every argument we'd ever had, every time he'd told me to leave the past alone. I thought back to when we were kids. My father would call us into the garage when he needed help moving something heavy. My brother always knew which end to grab, which corner to brace. I never asked how he knew. Now I wondered if the heavy things weren't always boxes or tools. The betrayal, if that's what it was, didn't come in a single moment. It came in a slow series of decisions, each one designed to keep me on the outside of something I thought I was part of. My brother and my father spoke in half sentences when I walked into a room. My mother pretended not to hear. I'd told myself it was nothing. Tonight, holding this letter, I knew it was everything. The hallway felt smaller now, as if the walls themselves were listening. The nightlight flickered again, but this time it stayed dim for longer than it should. I slid the letter back into the envelope and tucked it inside my sweater. Leaving it exposed on the floor felt like an invitation. Somewhere outside, a car passed slowly, its tires whispering against the wet road. The sound faded, replaced by the distant scrape of a shoe against pavement. Then a voice. Daniel. It was Tom, but different. The steadiness from earlier was gone. This was something else. Something cautious, uncertain. Come outside, he called. I stayed where I was, the letter pressing warm against my chest. There was no urgency in his tone now, no sharp edge like when he'd told me to get out at 3 a.m. My eyes were closed. I found myself pressing my ear to Herb's head, full of deep echoes. My first thought was the lone walrus, back in Newport Hills. Please, he said again, softer this time. I couldn't tell if it was a request or a warning. This time, he did not sound like he wanted me to get out. Tom's voice carried from the porch, but it lacked the clipped urgency it had before. He wasn't telling me to run, he was telling me, what? To come to him? To make myself visible? I stayed in the hallway, close enough to hear, far enough to remain unseen from the front window. The envelope inside my sweater felt heavier now, as if the paper itself had mass beyond its weight. Daniel, he called again, steady this time. Come on, we should talk. Talk? He had told me to leave my own house not an hour ago. Now he wanted to talk. I thought about the Tom I knew, the man who sharpened tools before returning them, the man who once spent an afternoon helping me fix a fence post in the rain without asking for anything in return, the man who also, on more than one occasion, asked oddly specific questions about my father, where he'd worked, who he'd known. I'd always chalked it up to neighborly curiosity. But maybe it hadn't been. The friction between us had been subtle but present. He'd hinted more than once that the lot my house sat on used to belong to someone else, someone who had been pushed out under circumstances he wouldn't explain. He'd once asked me, out of nowhere, if I trusted my family. I'd laughed then. He hadn't. I shifted closer to the wall by the front room, careful not to disturb the curtains. Through a narrow gap I could see him standing on the porch. He wasn't looking at the house. He was looking toward the street, like he was waiting for someone. That someone might not be the police. The idea tightened my chest. If Tom wasn't here to help me, then his earlier warning might not have been about danger from outside. It might have been about controlling what happened inside. He turned his head slightly, scanning the windows. I stepped back from the curtain before his gaze could find me. The thought came uninvited. Maybe Tom knew about the pawn, the pen, the cedar scent. Maybe he'd known about the vent all along. Maybe tonight hadn't started with him catching a stranger in my kitchen, but with him helping someone get inside. Daniel, he called again, quieter now, like he was speaking only for me. My mind moved too fast to settle on one truth. I couldn't decide if the greater risk was stepping onto that porch or staying in here with whoever had been moving through my house. A soft creak came from behind me, the storage room door easing open another inch. The air shifted, cooler against the back of my neck. Two forces, one outside, one inside, neither showing their full shape. I moved into the kitchen, keeping the island between me and the hallway. The pawn and the pen still sat where I'd left them. The sight of them anchored me, if only for a moment. From the porch, Tom's voice came one last time. We don't have much time. Before I could decide whether to answer, the house answered for me. The power cut out. The fridge hummed its last note and went silent. The night light in the hallway blinked and died. Every corner of the house folded into complete darkness. Without light, the house felt older, stranger, almost hostile. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier. Familiar spaces turned foreign, each shadow now a solid thing pressing in. I stood still, letting my eyes strain against the dark, knowing it would take minutes before I could trust them. The hum of the fridge was gone. The silence that replaced it felt wrong, like a room after an argument. Quiet, but charged. Somewhere in the blackness, the pawn and the pen still waited on the counter. I could feel their presence, the way you feel someone watching from another room. I took one slow step, letting the sole of my foot find the familiar cool of the kitchen tile. My memory mapped the house for me. 2 steps forward, reach the island's corner, turn left 4 paces to the hallway, avoid the second board from the wall. Creaks too loud. Every sound was amplified now. The faint brush of my sweater against the counter sounded like tearing paper. My own breathing filled my ears. Somewhere far off in the house, wood settled with a low groan, a reminder that I wasn't the only thing moving here tonight. The darkness pulled up older memories than I wanted. Nights in my childhood home when my father would walk the halls after everyone else had gone to bed. He'd pause outside doors, listening. He claimed he was checking locks, but I think he was taking inventory of his control, what he held, what he could lose. I remembered lying in bed, holding still when I heard him stop outside my room. I'd pretend to be asleep, knowing that if I moved or spoke, the night would change shape. He always moved on eventually, but the air he left behind felt heavier, as if the room remembered him even after he was gone. Now, decades later, the same air filled this house. Different walls, different roof, but the same weight pressing in. My father was gone, yet something of his making had found its way here. I reached the hallway and let my hand skim the wall until my fingertips brushed the cold metal of the vent cover I'd removed earlier. The envelope was still inside my sweater, the paper warm from my body heat. It felt less like a possession and more like a responsibility I hadn't asked for. Somewhere toward the front of the house, a faint scrape echoed. Cloth against wood, maybe. My mind tried to fit it to a person's movement, to measure the distance in steps, but the sound faded before I could pin it down. I thought of the letter's last lines. My father had kept proof of something dangerous, hidden so well he claimed even he couldn't look at it without knowing it was there. I'd assumed that was just his way of sounding important. Now, I wasn't so sure. Someone wanted me to see these pieces tonight. The pawn, the pen, the cedar-scented envelope. Each one a breadcrumb leading back to him. The past wasn't just visiting. It was taking shape here, using my house as a stage. I moved deeper into the hallway, heading toward the storage room. The darkness made it feel longer, as if the house had stretched in the dark to keep me walking. When I reached the doorway, the cedar smell hit stronger than before. I couldn't see the duffel on top of the boxes, but I could sense it there, its zipper half closed. I didn't step inside. The last thing I wanted was to turn my back to the hallway. A soft shift of air touched my cheek, coming from the kitchen's direction. I turned toward it. My mind replayed the map. Straight ahead to the island, then the back door just beyond. I stepped carefully, each movement slow enough that the boards under my feet wouldn't complain. My ears caught every subtle sound, the slight pop of cooling pipes, the whisper of fabric when I moved my arm. Halfway to the kitchen, I stopped. The air felt different now, cooler, like the kind that slips in from outside. My memory of the kitchen told me the back door was locked, the key still on its hook. But then came the sound. Faint. Deliberate. The slow turn of a key in a lock. At the back door. I had imagined this moment for years, but not like this. The lock turned the final fraction with a soft click, and the back door eased inward just enough to let the cooler air spill into the kitchen. A shadow filled the gap before I could move. Then a figure stepped inside, quiet as if they'd walked this floor 100 times before. The first thing I saw was the tilt of the head. The second was the way the light from the street caught the edge of their face. My brother. He didn't smile, but his eyes took me in like I was a problem he'd already solved. "You're still hard to reach," he said, closing the door behind him without turning the lock. I stayed near the island, one hand on the counter's edge. "You picked a good time to try. You think this is about time?" He glanced at the pawn and the pen sitting in plain view. "You found them." I didn't answer. "I left them for you," he went on. A way of saying, we need to talk. "Breaking into my house is your version of talking now?" He gave a half shrug. "You weren't picking up the phone, and you've never been good at hearing what you don't want to hear." The words carried weight, but they weren't new. We'd had versions of this exchange our whole lives. his voice calm, mine holding back anger. I nodded toward the back door. You could have just knocked. I did once, he said. You didn't open it then, either. The old memory landed between us. The night he stood in the rain, hands in his pockets, my father telling me to stay put. That night I hadn't moved. This one, I wasn't sure if I could. He stepped closer, his gaze flicking to the envelope under my arm. You read it. Some of it. Then you know why I'm here. I thought I did, but I wanted to hear him say it. Enlighten me. There are things in this house that don't belong to you. Things Dad should have destroyed a long time ago. Then why didn't he? My brother's jaw tightened. Because he was him. Because he couldn't help himself. The unspoken part was clear. Because our father didn't trust anyone enough to give up leverage, not even his own sons. And you, I asked, you just want to clean up for him now? I want to end it, his eyes didn't leave mine, before it ends us. There it was. The suggestion that whatever debt or secret had bound our father was still alive, still dangerous. The letter's mention of Carter Haynes came back to me. The careful wording, the admission of keeping proof. Who's pulling the strings now? I asked. You don't want that answer. Try me. He hesitated, then glanced toward the hallway, as if expecting someone else to step into the room. The less you know, the better. I did. My family had the worst. The last discipline or savagery picked at them. We stuck to the worst. The less you know. That's what Dad said. Look how well that worked. Something flickered in his expression. Regret or frustration, I couldn't tell. Daniel, I'm not here to fight you. I'm here to make an offer. I didn't move, but I felt the shift in the air between us. What kind of offer? I can make all of this go away. The people watching you, the calls, the reminders. I can make sure you never hear the name Carter Haynes again. And the cost? He took a slow step forward, lowering his voice. You give me the envelope. Whatever else you find here, you hand it over. You stop asking questions. You live your life like none of this happened. I studied him. The confidence in his tone was the same one he'd used when convincing me to cover for him as kids, to take the blame for things that weren't mine. But under it, I thought I caught something else. Urgency, fear, maybe. And if I say no, then, he said, you'll be left holding something a lot heavier than a piece of paper, and they'll come to take it from you. Not the way I did. The they hung in the room between us, undefined but sharp. His eyes dropped briefly to the pawn and the pen. Those weren't just for you, they were for me too, reminders. Dad liked to play the long game, but even pawns can reach the other side if they survive. He leaned forward just enough for his next words to land heavier. So, what's it going to be? I could hear my own breathing louder than his voice. He was close enough now that I could see the fine creases at the corners of his eyes, the lines that hadn't been there the last time we spoke. His offer still hung between us like a rope, one end in his hand, the other in mine. You're thinking too long, he said, tone even. Maybe I was. Or maybe I'd been thinking about this for years without knowing it, about whether I wanted to keep living in the shadow of someone else's choices, or if I was willing to step into the open and take the hits myself. Give me the envelope, Daniel, he said again, softer this time. I thought about safety, what it had meant in my life. Doors locked, blinds drawn, routines kept. Safety had been about control, and control had always been about trust. My father had trusted no one, and I had inherited just enough of that to make my life smaller than it had to be. If I gave him the envelope, I might get safety, at least for a while. The quiet would return, the phone wouldn't ring with voices I didn't recognize. I could walk into my kitchen without seeing the past laid out in small objects. But the quiet would be bought with ignorance. I'd be back where my father had wanted me, on the outside of a truth that shaped my life whether I knew it or not. I had made mistakes before, big ones. I'd let people make decisions for me just to keep the peace. I'd avoided asking the hard questions because I didn't want to be responsible for the answers. Every time I'd told myself I was just choosing not to get involved. In reality, I'd been choosing to disappear. Daniel. His voice was still calm, but the calm had edges now. Hi, Daniel. Hi. Come here. I looked at the envelope in my hands. The paper inside felt warm from where it had been against my chest. My father's handwriting waited in there, heavy with things he'd wanted to say and things he'd wanted to keep hidden. I slid it back inside my sweater. No. The word was small, but it was the clearest thing I'd said all night. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in something closer to calculation. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Probably, I said. But I've been handed too many decisions already made for me. This one's mine. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He looked at me like he was trying to measure how much of that was stubbornness and how much was resolve. Finally, he stepped back from the island. You don't know what you're holding. I know enough. He nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer all along. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled something out. I tensed, but it wasn't a weapon. He set it on the counter, between the pawn and the pen. It was a key. Old, brass, teeth worn smooth with use. Without another word, he turned and walked to the back door. He didn't lock it behind him when he stepped out. The key sat under the dim streetlight glow spilling through the window, waiting. The house was silent, but it did not feel empty. The air carried that charged stillness I'd felt as a kid when my father left a room, like the walls were still holding their breath. My brother was gone, the back door left unlatched, but his presence clung to the house in ways I couldn't name. I stood by the counter, looking at the pawn, the pen, and now the brass key. The three objects seemed unrelated, but together they formed a shape I hadn't recognized until tonight. A map back into the parts of my family I'd spent years trying to avoid. I locked the back door, turning the deadbolt slowly, listening to the solid click. It wasn't much, but it was mine. My father's rules had been about control. Mine could be about choice. The key stayed on the counter for a moment longer before I picked it up. Its metal was warm, as if it had been held for a long time before being set down. I turned it over in my palm, wondering what it opened, and whether using it would be stepping forward or backward. I put it in the drawer where I kept spare batteries and old receipts, somewhere safe but not somewhere sacred. It didn't get to live on display like the pen had earlier. That was the boundary I could draw tonight. The pawn was easier. I held it in my hand for a long moment, tracing the smudge of dried ink on its base. It felt like an inside joke I wasn't supposed to get. I walked it to the trash bin and dropped it in. The sound it made when it hit the plastic liner was smaller than I expected, but it stayed there. No second guessing, no pulling it back out. The pen was harder. It wasn't just an object. It was the last tangible piece of a fight I'd never won. Keeping it felt like keeping the argument alive. I opened the drawer again, this time placing the pen beside the key. If either of them came out, it would be because I chose to take them out, not because someone left them in my kitchen. I stayed there for a while, the quiet settling into something I could stand. My brother's footsteps had faded into the street by now. Tom's voice didn't return. Even the cedar scent seemed to pull back, retreating to some corner of the house. On the counter, my phone sat dark. The voicemail from earlier was still there, waiting. I'd only listened to it halfway before the words about the vent had stopped me cold. I unlocked the screen, thumb hovering for a second before pressing play. The voice was the same as before, calm, measured, sure of itself. You still keep it in the vent, it said. I'd expected it to end there again, but it didn't. A pause, and then, faintly, just like he told you to. The sound was the same, but I heard it differently now. The ticking hallway clock had been marking time the whole night, but now each click felt slower, more deliberate, like it was waiting for me to catch up. The house hadn't changed. I had. I sat at the table with the envelope in front of me, the brass key in the drawer, the pen beside it. The pawn was gone. It was a small victory, but one I could feel. I hadn't let it stay here, hadn't let it join the collection of things other people decided I should keep. The voicemail's last words, "just like he told you to," still echoed. I didn't need to guess who he was. My father's voice wasn't on the recording, but it was stitched through everything that had happened tonight. He'd told me to hide things, to wait, to follow rules he never intended to explain. I'd spent years doing exactly that. Tom's knock at 3 a.m. had started this night. His voice had carried urgency then, an edge that pushed me to move before I could think. If he'd been watching for someone else to arrive, or if he'd been part of it from the start, didn't matter as much now. The warning was still real, even if his reasons weren't. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about what my father or my brother wanted from me. I was thinking about what I wanted to do with what I knew. I poured a glass of water and drank it slowly, grounding myself in the simplest act I could think of. No rush, no panic. I walked the perimeter of the house, checking every door, every window, not because I thought someone would come back tonight, but because it felt like claiming the space again. Each click of a lock was my own choice, not a rule handed down. In the hallway, I paused at the vent. The screws were still loose from earlier. I could put the envelope back, hide it away until the weight of it became background noise again. But I didn't. I carried it to the bedroom instead, and placed it in a box on the top shelf of the closet. Somewhere I could see it. Somewhere I could decide when to face it. The letter didn't scare me anymore. The danger was still there, yes, but so was the knowledge. My father had chosen to carry it alone. My brother had chosen to use it as a bargaining chip. I didn't have to do either. The house settled around me as I moved back to the kitchen. The night felt lighter somehow, the silence cleaner. I thought about Tom's first words, "Someone's been in your house. Get out." I'd stayed, not out of stubbornness, but because I'd realized running wouldn't change the fact that the past had already moved in. I turned off the kitchen light, letting the street lamp spill just enough glow to keep the shapes of the room. My hand rested on the counter for a moment, then slid away. The brass key stayed in the drawer. The pawn stayed gone. The pen stayed where I'd put it. When I finally sat down again, the clock in the hallway ticked once, steady and certain. I let it. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to measure my breathing against it.